All right, everyone, we are talking about tendons today. So first off, what exactly does a tendon do? What, people get asked that question quite often. A tendon, what a tendon technically does is it transmits force from a muscle to a bone. But what it does is you can see in the picture here, and I don't know that I can find a pointer here because I'm technologically inept. But if you can see down here, um, that it's a picture of a knee and the quadriceps muscle. And you can see there's the patellar tendon there at the bottom of the quadriceps muscle. So all of our muscles have a tendon and it connects the muscle to a bone. What it really does though is it transmits the force of the muscle. So a muscle squeezes, and because the muscles or a tendon connects that muscle to a bone, as the muscle squeezes, that tendon allows that muscle to pull the bone with it because it's attached to it. So if you imagine, I'm trying to think of an example here, but um, that is how a tendon works. So again, we all have them. So like, let's say, actually, here's my arm, my bicep muscle here. Let me just do this. Actually see the muscle. What little of it is, there's a biceps muscle here. My tendon is right here. For me to squeeze this muscle, when this muscle squeezes, it pulls on this tendon, which is attached to this bone right here. So this muscle squeezes, and I am able to bend my arm because this is pulling from through the tendon into the bone down here where it's inserted. So basically that's tendon. Things that we look at though, there's a lot more research coming out because I mean tendonitis and tendon injuries have been around forever. However, we're starting to look at more of the kind of mechanical properties of a tendon, which is pretty cool in terms of rehab from injuries and treating injuries to tendons, but also in terms of training as well. So certain things that we look at in terms of mechanics of a certain tendon are the amount of strain that a tendon can take, the amount of tendon stress that it can take as well, or basically the amount of force it can take, the stiffness, how stiff a tendon is, or different relationships between all those different factors. The interesting thing is tendons respond very well to load. So what load is a weight or a strain or a force or something that a tendon needs to do. Tendons respond well to being used and having to be used and having to produce movement. This comes into play when you have a tendon injury where it hurts to use a tendon. We used to, back when I was in PT school, we were realizing this wasn't the way to go, but the old way was just stretch a tendon, stretch and it'll feel better. Just pulling on that tendon actually doesn't really help it feel better, but using the tendon does in a lot of reasons. So the other way the cool thing about tendons here is that tendons adapt pretty rapidly to a stress that like training puts on it. So if you are lifting weights, if you are doing sprint training, if you are doing things, if that training is planned well enough and if it's kind of thoughtfully planned out, the tendon can adapt very well to that stress, and you can make training gains also from kind of building up your muscles, but also you make gains in the tendon itself. This happens down at like the cellular level of the tendon. It's actually research has shown that kind of changes along with different mechanical properties. So earlier I mentioned we can look at things of how stiff a tendon is. So tendons are elastic. If you think of like a rubber band, not the greatest analogy, but you think of how a rubber band can stretch. That if it's stiffer rubber band stretches less versus a very stretchable elastic rubber band. That same analogy can be applied to a tendon. It's very common for the Achilles tendon in our ankle and the patellar tendon around the knee to get stiffer with exercise, and that's actually a good thing. We want that. Studies have also shown things like that the tendon can get thicker at different parts along the tendon itself with different training plans. The other interesting thing about this is there seems to be kind of a threshold here, though, where that loading or that training has to be of sufficient intensity. So you can't just kind of I'm going to do a little bit of training, but it's not very intense, you're not going to get changes down to the level of the tendon. So you need to be doing training the right way. You don't want to be doing too much to irritate the heck out of it and inflame it, but you have to do enough that that loading is going to bring those adaptations that we want. If it's below that threshold, we're not going to get any good adaptations. In fact, even sometimes if it's below that intensity, you can actually have the tendon kind of what we would call maladaptation, where it would actually changes that we don't want would happen because it's not being loaded to the point that it needs to be for what you're trying to have that tendon do, whether it's a sports performance thing or a rehab or that kind of thing. Again, as I mentioned, there's this tendon threshold here. We're still trying to figure out for different tendons, how much is too much. But we just need to understand that it needs to be of sufficient intensity. We can't just have people doing kind of exercises where they're just kind of like, if we want those adaptations to take place, we need to work for it, to be honest. There's kind of this sweet spot where, again, I mentioned we don't want to do too much and we don't want to do too little. So what we do know now, lifting heavy and lifting slow. So having reps that last like 6 seconds even, and doing things that, in the set range of 6 to 8. So we're not doing, this is not, sets of 12 to 15 of like a fast movement. This is trying to lift heavy and slow. The other thing we want to make sure that we do is we want to avoid excessive reps, as I mentioned. We're not doing sets of 15 or something like that. When we're trying to put a sufficient load on a tendon. I'm not saying that there's no time and place for those reps in training, but we're talking about tendons today, and this is what's most applicable. We don't want, there's a kind of a saturation point where around the 40 to 60 rep mark, the tendon, it's kind of at its max. It's maxed out. It kind of becomes saturated with the load there. And any unneeded volume, it will make that person or that athlete tired into the next session, and then we may not get as much of a benefit at the next session. So we want to make sure that when you're working a tendon, you're trying to load it appropriately, that it can have sufficient time. We want to fatigue it, but we need that recovery time before the next session or the next day or even in 2 days or that kind of thing. All right, that is it for tendons. Kind of a little different discussion than some people may have heard about tendons before. Feel free to send any questions you may have to info@clesportspt.com or check out my website. The contact info is on there as well. See you all next week.